Okay, thank you very much. I also want to start by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to be here and for putting together this interesting school and conference. I will switch the topic a little bit from previous talks and discuss non-equilibrium dynamics in correlated systems. This is an important research direction in which I think dynamical mean field methods can play an important role. In particular, I will discuss some results we have obtained in recent years concerning thermalization and non-equilibrium critical behavior in the Hubbard model. This is work done by and in collaboration with Martin Eckstein and Naoto Tsuchi. These are two former postdocs, and both of them are very brilliant young researchers. Martin is now a professor in Hamburg, and Naoto is a research associate in Tokyo University. One reason why people are interested in exploring non-equilibrium properties of correlated systems is that driving a system out of equilibrium can provide a new way of tuning the material properties. For example, we know that the properties of cuprates change very much as a function of chemical doping. The parent compound is an antiferromagnetic Mott insulator, and as one dopes holes into the system by chemical substitution, one finds a bad metallic phase and eventually a superconductor. So it is an interesting question, what happens in a correlated system if we produce double and hole pairs by photo-excitation instead of chemical doping. So that's one issue. Another issue which Otwan has already mentioned in his lecture is that by stimulating, for example, certain phonon modes in correlated systems, one can induce long-lived transient states which have interesting properties such as superconductivity above equilibrium transition temperature. Anyhow, in all these cases, an interesting question is how these systems relax into these transient states, or eventually thermalize back to a thermal state. And also if there is a phase transition, if we can see something like a non-equilibrium version of critical behavior associated with this phase transition. Now, we are not yet in a position to study complicated materials such as cuprates out of equilibrium, but we are now basically ready to study simple model systems such as the Hubbard model using some approximate or exact numerical techniques. And the idea is to use the dynamical mean field formalism, which by now is familiar to everybody. This formalism replaces a correlated lattice system by a single-site effective model, which is a quantum impurity model. And the nice thing is that this approximation works exactly the same way also out of equilibrium, because the main approximation involves the spatial degrees of freedom. We replace a lattice system by a single-site model, thereby neglecting all spatial fluctuations. But we treat the time-dependent fluctuations exactly or very accurately, and so we can easily apply this formalism to out-of-equilibrium systems. And that has been realized more than 10 years ago by Hartmut Monin, and then the formalism was properly worked out in 2006 by Jim Freerichs and collaborators. The challenge then in these non-equilibrium calculations becomes the computation of the real-time evolution of such a quantum impurity model, and various techniques have been tried out over the last few years, and I will say a few more words about this in the coming slides. Let me just mention now also that single-site dynamical mean field theory can also treat two sublattice type ordered phases, such as antiferromagnetic phases. The only thing one has to understand is that in a two sublattice type ordered phase, the path for the A sublattice is given by the sites belonging to the B sublattice and vice versa. And then, for example, in a Néel ordered phase, what one ends up with is the same type of self-consistency condition, except that at some point one has to switch the spin components of the path. But otherwise, the formalism can be directly applied and without any additional complications to these type of ordered phases. Now, just a few words about the impurity solvers. What we have to do in a non-equilibrium calculation is to compute the time evolution of some observable. The definition of this time-dependent observable is given here, and we can read this formula as follows. We start from a thermal initial state, represented here in this picture by the propagation along this imaginary time branch of the contour from 0 to minus I beta. Then we propagate forward in time from time 0 to time t. We measure the observable at time t, and we propagate back. So one way of treating this then numerically is to express all these time evolution operators on these three branches of this contour as time-ordered exponentials in some interaction representation, and then expand these exponentials. And this gives these collections of, for example, interaction vertices on this contour in a weak coupling approach. And then we can integrate out the fermionic degrees of freedom, and this gives these weak coupling diagrams on the contour, which consist of interaction vertices here in red, connected by Bath Green's functions in black. And these we can sample using Monte Carlo technique. Because of the sign problem, this Monte Carlo technique can only treat relatively short time. So if we want to study longer time behavior of the system, we may want to use another method, such as perturbation theory. For weak coupling, for the weak coupling case, we can, for example, truncate the weak coupling expansion of the self-energy at second order, and then plug this expression for the self-energy into the Dyson equation. Now, this is a Dyson equation on this L-shaped contour, but it's the same thing, and thereby generate a subset of all weak coupling diagrams in a computationally efficient way. So that works in the weak correlation regime. In the strong correlation regime, we can do strong coupling perturbation theory, such as the non-crossing approximation. What one does there is one introduces so-called pseudo particle propagators for each atomic state of the system. So for the Anderson impurity models, these are 4 states. And then for these pseudo-particle Green's functions, one defines self-energies, which one expresses in a strong coupling expansion, and then truncates this expansion, for example, at lowest order in the hybridization lambda, and then inserting these types of self-energies into a Dyson equation, one can generate a subset of all the strong coupling diagrams. And this method is very useful in strongly interacting systems such as Mott insulators. Now, before I start to show real data, let me remind you of the phase diagram of the Hubbard model in DMFT. This is the phase diagram if we restrict our calculation to paramagnetic states. At low temperature, there's a first-order transition from metal to Mott insulator, and at high temperature, there's a smooth crossover between these two phases. If we allow for antiferromagnetic order, then there is an antiferromagnetic insulating phase at all interactions at low enough temperature, and this crossover at higher temperatures. At half filling, there is a symmetry between the repulsive and attractive Hubbard model, which allows us to directly translate the results we obtain for the repulsive Hubbard model to the attractive side. And in this case, for example, this weak coupling Slater type antiferromagnet maps onto the BCS superconducting phase, and the Mott or local moment type antiferromagnet becomes the BEC superconductor. And I will in the following concentrate only on the repulsive part of this phase diagram, but everything I will say about antiferromagnets can be directly translated to BCS superconductors. So let me start with this, the actual DMFT calculations. And the first calculation I want to discuss is a calculation for an interaction quench, which means we start in a non-interacting system at 0 temperature and then suddenly switch on the interaction. And that was actually the first non-equilibrium dynamical mean field calculation which was done for the Hubbard model, and I think it's still one of the most interesting results. which has come out of this type of formalism. And what I show you here in this phase diagram is the location where we end up after thermalization. And I show this to mention that this system is highly excited by the quench. There's a lot of energy pumped into the system by the quench, and after thermalization we end up in a high temperature paramagnetic state. Now if we look at the momentum distribution function, how it evolves, we see that the evolution depends very much on how strongly we quench the system. If we only quench a little bit, so switch on a small interaction, what happens is that the distribution function, which is initially a step function, that's the Fermi function at temperature 0, evolves like this. So the discontinuity, which marks the Fermi energy, is initially reduced, but then it stabilizes at some value before it then vanishes at much longer time scales. And this plateau here, which you can see in the jump of the discontinuity, in this discontinuity in the distribution function, indicates a delayed thermalization process. In a thermal state at non-zero temperature, the distribution function will always be a smooth function, so the discontinuity must disappear. So the presence of this discontinuity and its persistence here is an indication for delayed thermalization, and this has been studied within perturbation theory by various people, and there's a name for it, and it's called a pre-thermalization. So what people find is that in weakly interacting systems, the system does not immediately thermalize after a perturbation, but instead it is trapped in a non-thermal state, which can be quite different from the final thermalized state, and that's called pre-thermalization. What we see here in this DMFT calculation is that a similar type of trapping occurs if we quench to very strong interaction. In this case, the discontinuity initially disappears, but then it reappears and starts to oscillate in a manner which is reminiscent of the periodic 1/u oscillations which one finds in the atomic limit. So in the strong coupling regime, there's a different type of pre-thermalization where the system is trapped in a state which is characterized by these so-called collapse and revival oscillations. Most interestingly, in between these two cases, there's one specific point, one specific value of the interaction where we see neither this type of plateau nor any kind of collapse and revival oscillations, but instead a very fast thermalization. So the discontinuity vanishes after a few inverse hopping times, and then the system, for all practical purposes, looks like it is thermalized. And to emphasize the special nature of this point, what we show in this diagram here is on the left-hand side the height of this discontinuity in the pre-thermalized state, and on the right-hand side the height at the first revival maximum as a function of interaction, and you can see how both of these vanish at the same interaction u, and that's the place where we see this very fast thermalization. So there is some kind of transition in the dynamics of the system where there is a qualitative change in the relaxation dynamics, and that's a transition which occurs in a highly excited system and which is not very obviously connected to any zero temperature or low temperature phase transition. So that's one result which we have obtained using this non-equilibrium DMFT formalism. As a next problem, I want to study photo-excitation in a Mott insulator, and in particular I want to ask the question, on which time scale will this photo-excited system thermalize? And for this we now use this strong coupling approximation as impurity solver, and we focus on the Mott insulating side at not too low temperature. And what we do is we apply a few cycle electric field pulse to this system, and the frequency of this pulse is chosen in such a way that we can easily excite double and whole pairs across the gap. And the amplitude of the pulses in these two calculations were chosen such that the absorbed energy is the same in both cases. So after the pulse, the energy is constant and the same for both. And so we can translate this energy into an effective temperature of the eventually thermalized system. So that's just the temperature which in a thermal equilibrium corresponds to this total energy. And then we may compare various physical quantities to the thermal value which we expect after thermalization. And then for the double occupancy, it looks something like this. So during the pulse, the double occupancy goes up. That's the excitation of electrons across the gap. But then it stabilizes, and it stabilizes in a value which is quite different from the expected thermal value at long times. And now, in order to extract the lifetime of this non-thermal state, we subtract this thermal value and plot the difference on a logarithmic scale, and that gives a result like this. So you can see that very far away from this crossover regime, this non-thermal state is very stable, and we can't really extract the lifetime from this. But as we reduce the interaction and approach this crossover regime, we start to see an exponential relaxation towards the thermal state. And yes? Not here, no, because this is a different density of states. This is a hypercubic lattice. But yeah, something similar shows up here. I will point it out in a minute. So anyhow, what we see is that the relaxation time becomes faster and faster as we approach this crossover regime. And if we extract the relaxation time from these exponential curves, we see that the lifetime grows more than exponentially as a function of interaction strength or as a function of the gap. So in a Mott insulator or with a large gap, the lifetime of these photo-excited states is very, very long. And what we can also see in this curve is that the value from which this exponential thermalization sets in becomes smaller and smaller as we approach this intermediate coupling regime. And at some point around 1.5 now for this hypercubic case, there's again a very fast thermalization so that we cannot even see this exponential thermalization. So this is a logarithmic scale, and 10 to the minus 5 is about the limit of our numerical accuracy in these calculations. So again, at intermediate, somewhere at intermediate interactions, there's a qualitatively different relaxation pathway which leads to very fast thermalization. Okay, that was for photodoping of a paramagnetic Mott insulator. Now I want to study something like photodoping in an antiferromagnetically ordered system. And well, actually I will not do here a photodoping calculation, but I will do an interaction quench calculation. But basically what this interaction quench from intermediate to strong interaction does, it is freezing in quantum fluctuations, double and whole pairs, which exist in the initial state as virtual fluctuations. They become real doublons and holes after the quench, and so it's effectively the same thing as a photodoping calculation. And what you see on this slide is the phase diagram for the antiferromagnetic phase on the strong coupling side, obtained within this non-crossing approximation. And we start deep in the antiferromagnetic insulator and then increase the interaction to a stronger value. And the dotted line here shows the temperature expected after thermalization. And what you see here, for example, is if we quench from 4 to 8, after thermalization, we are expected to thermalize somewhere in a very high temperature paramagnetic state. That's something we can determine from energy, based on energy considerations. So it's quite interesting to see then what happens to the magnetization for this quench from 4 to 8. So we know in the long time limit it will be a paramagnetic state, so the magnetization will be 0. But if we now look at the time evolution after this quench, you see that the system is trapped again in a state which has a very large magnetization. So there's a non-thermal state, completely non-thermal state, which has a large antiferromagnetic order. And also, if we look at the time-dependent spectral function, we see that, so this is for the minority spin, we see that initially the spin imbalance goes down. That's the initial reduction of the magnetization. But then the spectral function becomes time-independent, and it looks very much like the spectral function of an antiferromagnetic insulator. And actually, we can compare it to that of an undoped Mott insulator at U equals 8. And you can see it's quite similar. And we can get an even better agreement if we dope this equilibrium Mott insulator. That's now the black curve. And you can see that we can get a very good agreement with this non-equilibrium spectral function if we adjust the doping to about 1%. So the conclusion from this comparison is that this photodoped insulator is, for many practical purposes, similar to a chemically doped insulator with a chemical doping of about 1%. And what the calculation also shows, because of this trapping, is that this insulator is somehow below the antiferromagnetic transition temperature. And that's a sort of remarkable effect, and I believe it's a sort of entropy cooling effect. Something like entropy cooling effect. If you reduce the magnetization of the system, you release a lot of entropy, and that allows the electrons to cool down and behave as if they were in an effectively very cold state. Anyhow, what this picture here suggests is that if we increase the photodoping concentration, eventually we will cross this antiferromagnetic transition line, and then we will not see any trapping anymore. And that's exactly what happens, and we can increase the doping in our quench calculations by reducing the initial interaction. Then after the quench, we will have more doublons and holes frozen in, and that's a larger doping. And now here you see that as we go from weakly doped to strongly doped, eventually the trapped state disappears, and we see an exponential relaxation to the paramagnetic state. And we can again extract the lifetime from these exponential fits, and then as a function of initial interaction or photodoping concentration, we see a divergence in the lifetime or in the relaxation time of this antiferromagnetic order. So we have here something like a critical behavior here at some critical value of the photodoping. So this is again a kind of phase transition in a non-equilibrium system. Here as a function of photodoping, we see a transition in the time evolution of the magnetization from trapped to exponentially decaying. Okay, and in the last part of the talk, I want to switch now to the weak coupling side of the antiferromagnet. So this is the phase transition line on the weak coupling side, and again we do a quench from the antiferromagnetic to the paramagnetic phase, and the black dots here again indicate the temperature where we will end up after the quench, something like this. And here's the result for the magnetization for various values of the final interaction. So I quench now from the black to the pink point here, which is very close to the antiferromagnetic phase boundary, and then we see that the magnetization shows nice amplitude oscillations and eventually sort of saturates. But again, if we compare the saturation or the point where it stabilizes to the thermal value, which we expect after thermalization, we see that it's a different value, so that again we have a trapping of the system in a non-thermal state. And even more interestingly, if we quench now to the paramagnetic side of this phase boundary, we know that the system will thermalize in the paramagnetic state, so the magnetization will go to 0 at long times, but you see that on short times, we still have these amplitude oscillations around a pretty large non-thermal magnetization. So there's again a very clear trapping phenomenon and a delayed thermalization. So we have again this pre-thermalization in this calculation. And only if we quench far away or sufficiently far away from the phase boundary do we see something like an exponential relaxation of the order parameter. Now, these trapping and oscillations of the order parameter is similar to what we find in the Hartree approximation. Hartree approximation is the lowest order weak coupling approximation. Okay. Okay, thank you. And you can see it behaves very similarly. So we have these amplitude oscillations and eventually a switching to an exponential decay. And within Hartree, we don't see any thermalization. So Hartree is the Hartree theory has too many conserved quantities. So this theory does not show thermalization, but on short time scales, at least qualitatively, the time evolution looks very similar to what we see in the more sophisticated DMFT calculation with third order perturbation theory. So let us then quantitatively analyze these curves here and, for example, measure the frequency of these amplitude oscillations for the different interactions. And that gives this curve here, which plots the frequency of the amplitude mode as a function of the final interaction. And on the weak coupling side, we can analyze these exponentially decaying curves and measure the decay time for these exponential curves. And if we plot the inverse decay time or dephasing time as a function of interaction, we get these blue dots here. And now the very interesting thing is that these two lines, the red and the blue one, extrapolate to zero at some point here, which is obviously different from the interaction where the thermal phase transition takes place. So there's something like a critical behavior associated with a non-thermal critical point, which does not exist in equilibrium. And actually, we can more closely analyze these exponential curves here in the weak coupling regime. And then what we find is that it is a two-step relaxation. We have a slow exponential decay, which we call dephasing, and which is associated with this non-thermal critical point, which is followed by a faster exponential decay, which is then the thermalization process. And the lifetimes, or the inverse lifetimes of this thermalization process is then extrapolating to the thermal critical point. So the picture then which emerges from these calculations is that as we quench our antiferromagnet, the antiferromagnetic system becomes unstable and the system wants to flow towards the paramagnetic fixed point. But it doesn't flow like this directly, but instead somehow a new fixed point pops up in the Hamiltonian space, and initially the system now starts to flow towards this non-thermal fixed point, which we can think of as something like the Hartree fixed point. And as it flows towards this fixed point, we see this trapping in the non-thermal magnetized state. And only on much longer timescales do we then see the approach towards the true thermal fixed point. And so this is very interesting theoretical result. The question you may ask is, has it anything to do with reality? And so we were very happy to see a recent publication from a group in Tokyo which studied a BCS superconductor, BCS superconductor perturbed by a terahertz pulse. Terahertz pulse is a low energy pulse which is not strong enough to break the Cooper pairs, but it can somehow excite the order parameter, the superconducting order parameter. And what you see here is the change in the superconducting order parameter, which is measured after pulses of different intensity, and we should flip this around like this. And then it's quite obviously similar to our calculation. So you see how we have sort of oscillations in the superconducting order parameters with a superimposed drift. And in particular, you can also see how the frequencies of these oscillations change and become slower and slower as we perturb the system more and more strongly. So this is very much consistent with our DMFT calculations, and that I think is a nice example which shows that probably the physics which we see in these calculations is real, and that dynamical mean field theory can play an important role in understanding the non-equilibrium properties of correlated systems. And with this, I'm done, and I thank you for your attention. I just want to point out that we recently wrote a review article about non-equilibrium DMFT. I think there has been enough interesting results accumulated over the last 5-6 years that it was justified to write a review. And so if you are interested in this, please take a look at this archive paper. So thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, Philip. So regarding the beautiful superconducting results that you showed in the end of your talk, yes. I had always understood that the special thing about S-wave superconductors was that order parameter relaxation was very slow because ordinary impurities were not pair breaking, and you really needed a dynamical phonon to do something. So there was some sort of hidden, not even so hidden conservation law in the superconducting case. Then the analogy you draw to your results on the Hubbard model would suggest that there's a similar sort of hidden conservation law. So the question is, do you know what that is?
Well, yeah, I think the way I think about this delayed thermalization here is that on short time scales, you really, the system is like a Hartree dynamics, because the higher order interactions don't play a role yet. So you need a certain time for the higher order processes to become relevant. So on short time scales, your system behaves, at least qualitatively, as if it were just a Hartree dynamics. And the Hartree dynamics has enough conserved quantities that there is actually no thermalization. So, yeah, and the weaker the interaction, the longer the time scale on which this Hartree dynamics properly describes the evolution of the system. So in the weak coupling limit, I think, yeah, that's the reason why thermalization is very, very slow. And then as you increase the interactions, the higher order processes start to act more quickly, and then basically eventually you just see a crossover, no really a trapped state anymore. But yeah, I mean, what this result suggests is that a purely electronic mechanism can explain also this type of very slow thermalization process. Whether or not phonons are important in the experiment, I don't know.
This is to draw your attention that similar data for relaxation of doublons have been obtained in cold atom systems by Esslinger's group.
Yes,
and of course in the large interaction limit. But in that context, I would like to ask you one question, because we were doing a theory for that, and what we found is that NCA severely underestimates, like the NCA results were a factor of 10 off if we look at what the exponential of U over T is. So you have an exponential relaxation time scale, right? Which goes exponentially with the interaction.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't claim that this is a new result. That's true. That has been discussed in the cold atom context before. And we have, in the publication which we wrote, there are the results for NCA and OCA. And yeah, indeed, there is a shift in this curve. So the numbers change if you go from NCA to OCA, but the exponential scaling remains almost exactly the same.
Yeah, but have you tried to match with Tillman's data and see which one works somewhat?
No, we haven't done. But yeah, I think the OCA should probably be pretty close to exact.
Okay, one quick question before we...
Yeah.
Can I ask the next speaker to come out? No, you can ask your question.
Yeah, hi. So my question is regarding the results you showed for the Hubbard model. So as we change we have these different relaxation schemes depending on the U. Can I understand that relaxation dependence as I increase the U, my integrability of the system is spoiled, because integrability is very important. The relaxation depends on the integrability.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's more or less the explanation for this trapping phenomenon in the weak coupling regime. You are very close to an integrable limit, which is the non-interacting limit, and therefore you have a very sort of long-lived pre-thermal state. So this kind of pre-thermal state you can understand with second-order perturbation theory. So it's really the proximity to an integrable point, which is responsible. And here we have also an integrable point, which is the infinite U limit, where you just see expect a 1 over U periodic oscillations of the system.
Yeah, one other question is, how do the results compare with the parallel study on the flow equation-based methods? I mean, they have also done some studies on the Hubbard model, but using the flow equation method. Sort of a Hamiltonian renormalization.
Yeah, that's something like a weak coupling theory. And what they see, they can explain with this flow equation, they can explain the relaxation into this pre-thermalized state. But what they cannot explain is then the eventual crossover and thermalization of the system. So that is, so DMFT can give you both. So it gives you this pre-thermalized state plus then the eventual thermalization at longer times.
All right, may I suggest we save all other questions for the lunch break. Let's thank the speaker for a wonderful talk.